get started. Welcome, everybody. We're super excited for everybody to be here for our third in our summer policy series on strengthening families. And today is all about connecting families to resources. Our first series, if you were able to tune in this summer, was focused on that continuum of supports that we are hopeful to have in communities to support families. The second session was on the extended family, right? Using an extended family of informal kin and other family to support the children. And then the last session, this one today, is on connecting families to resources. And so we're very excited. We've got some really strong speakers from across the state, and I love seeing all of the faces. So thank you guys for being here today. Welcome. I see folks from across the state, and it's just always good to connect. So please put who you're with, your name and who you're with in the chat. We love to see who tunes in. And just want to give a shout out and thank you to Casey Family Programs for sponsoring today. This is an issue of importance to so many of us, right? There's so many fantastic community-based programs and state-funded programs from across in communities across the state. We want to make sure families get connected to them and love seeing how this is important to so many people. So thank you for being here. Let's see if I can move to the next slide. So my name's Adriana. I'm the CEO of TextProtects. I just finished my 1 year on the job last week. Yay, made it a year, and I'm very excited to be headed into year 2. And wanted to tell you a little bit about TextProtects. We focus on advancing policy and policy implementation that strengthens families to prevent abuse and neglect. And so you can now see why today fits right in line with our mission statement. Policy implementation for us means supporting community providers and all the wonderful services that exist in communities throughout the state. So again, this is really critical that we connect families to those resources. In our history, we've passed over 54 bills and provided and secured over $265 million for home visiting programs. So we are excited about that and proud of that history, and are going to continue working on that this upcoming session. So again, thank you for being here today. I'm going to turn it over to Carrie, who is our Director of Policy and Advocacy, who's going to lay out the topic and then also introduce you to our fabulous speakers. So without further delay, Carrie, you're up.
Thanks, Adriana. So again, for those of you who don't know me, Carrie Giudice, I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at TextProtects. I've been here for about 4 years, but I have been working in the child welfare space in some way, shape, or form for 16 years. I've been in different capacities, but really my passion is, working with children and families and making sure that they can thrive. And so, Adriana already kind of set a little bit of this earlier. So for those of you that have been able to tune in to our policy series, that very first one was about making sure that we have that continuum of preventative services for families, because we want to see families strengthen. We want to see families remain together. And now we want to turn our attention to a conversation that's actually about making sure that families are actually connected to those resources successfully. We can have all of the services in the world, but if families and the professionals working with them don't know who to call, then having those services available isn't going to be as helpful. So we have a wonderful group, seriously, for panelists today. I want to go ahead and introduce who they are, because we're really going to be weaving them in and out throughout this conversation. So I want to make sure to introduce them in the beginning. So we have Stephen Black. He's with the Department of Family and Protective Services and is the Associate Commissioner for Statewide Intake. I think most of you on this call know what that means, but it's essentially the State Abuse and Neglect Hotline. We also have Audrey Carmichael, who is the Vice President for Legal and Regulatory Affairs with the Texas Alliance of Child and Family Services. You'll hear me refer to them as the Alliance. And she also used to work for DFPS. We have Brandon Logan, who is the executive director of One Accord in West Texas, and they have the contract for Find Help West Texas over there, and you'll hear him talk about that later. We also have Audrey Roast. She is the Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives and Public Policy with the United Way of San Antonio and Bexar County. They're doing some fantastic things over there. And lastly, we have Carol Self, who is the Public Policy Director with KC Family Programs, who also used to work for DFPS. And as you heard Adriana say, KC Family has been so gracious as to sponsor this series. So we're going to be taking questions at the end. So if you've got like a pressing question, put it in the chat, and that way we can make sure to get to it. I don't want you guys to forget any questions that you may want answered. But yeah, please put those in the chat and we'll be monitoring that later. But first, I kind of want to do a little bit of I want to have a moment where we all can kind of just think about the circumstances we're talking about. I want everyone to take a moment and just kind of imagine this with me. Imagine you are in dire need for your family and you don't know where to go. You don't know what to do. And perhaps you're vulnerable enough to confide in someone that you need help. Adriana, if you could go ahead and progress to the next slide. Again, what we're talking about is, think about it. You're in those circumstances. You just need some connection to something in your community. And again, you want to know where to turn. So right now, what we're seeing in our state is sometimes parents and professionals don't know who to seek out to support. So many are actually calling the statewide intake hotline for something that's not abuse or neglect. And we're seeing that in 4 out of 10 of the calls. They don't meet that definition of abuse or neglect. And I know that's a little bit of an oversimplification. I know Stephen Black will get into that in a second. But we know that a large chunk of those are families or providers calling when really they just need some help. So Stephen, I'm hoping you can start us off here and walk us through kind of the parameters of what statewide intake is set up to do and what you guys do when someone calls in and doesn't meet that definition of abuse or neglect.
Sure. So statewide intake, our program's grown a little bit over the past few years. We really have 3 core functions, the biggest which is intake, which we'll be talking about mostly today, and that we consider ourselves the front door to the front line. We answer over 400,000 phone calls a year, process another 170,000 e-reports, and the function of intake is to determine whether or not somebody's concerns meet that legal definition of abuse or neglect, and to whether or not it needs protective services intervention. There are a couple other divisions we have now. The secondary screening division is now part of statewide intake. They look at a subset of lower priority CPS cases to spend a little more time with the case before it goes to investigator, do more extensive research of case history, contact collaterals, and they also make a determination whether a case may go the alternative response route. And then we have a third division, which is our helplines. We run the Texas Youth Helpline, which dates back to the 1970s. It's formerly the Texas Runaway Hotline. And in the past couple of years, we also launched the Texas Parent Helpline. Now, going back to kind of the data we're looking at, in that, I've talked about all the calls that come to us, and yet, less than 60% of those phone calls or in-net reports result in the DFPS intake for investigation. And so there is a little nuance here, like you mentioned. Sometimes people are calling us because they're not intending to report abuse neglect, but they know there's an open case. They want to provide some additional information. We also take the standards compliance reports for daycare and childcare licensing, so we get some of those. And there's occasional reports we get that may be considered abuse neglect. It just doesn't fall into our jurisdiction. Maybe based on who the perpetrator is, it's more of a law enforcement matter, or it could be something more appropriate for a different state. So all that's kind of factored into that 4 and 10. But that being said, there's still, any given year, more than 80,000 reports that we're going to get that just somebody's calling for help. They're calling to report what they may think is abuse or neglect, but it really doesn't meet those legal definitions. And in those situations, we're not really providing any ongoing services to those families. Now, when somebody's calling because they have a concern, we don't like for them to leave completely empty-handed. We do have a referral page our staff can access to try to coordinate them with a different phone number they may want to call, whether that's shelter related, whether that's family law related, maybe the concern's more appropriate for the TEA and not DFPS, whatever the concern may be, we do at least try to give them some other referral when we end that phone call. Or maybe we refer them to our own youth and parent helpline if it seems appropriate. However, the intake specialist is there to assess for abuse and neglect. And once that's done, they have to kind of end the call, unfortunately, as quickly as they can to get to that next call. And so they're going to make that referral. They're going to end the phone call. And that's kind of the end of the DFPS involvement in this situation.
Well, and thank you for just kind of a little bit more of the breakdown of that information. So you mentioned, some people just calling because they think it might be abuse or neglect. Do y'all also get a lot of calls from folks that, maybe you're just kind of checking the box because they're like, okay, there's, we feel like we need to make this phone call, maybe, certain providers, things like that.
I would say so. I mean, it's not unheard of to get a phone call from an organization or an institution where they may even tell us, I don't think this is abuse or neglect, but because of their own internal procedures, they have to call it in, which, whenever I'm speaking to groups, one thing I want to stress, if you really don't know, call us. I mean, our staff are trained to make those decisions, and sometimes those decisions are complicated and they're complex. And so if you're really not sure, I encourage everybody to call, and that's the role of the intake specialist, to make those decisions and maybe shut down those things that don't truly meet. However, we do get some phone calls where individuals are pretty much telling us this isn't abuse. We don't think it's abuse. And the law is pretty clear. The mandated reported law is when you suspect abuse. And so we have to go through that process and handle those phone calls when we all know on both sides of that conversation that the reporting is not going to be appropriate for DFPS involvement.
Gotcha. So something you said is, it's kind of the, I know you didn't use these words, but I know I've heard before, it's like when in doubt, report or things like that. So honestly, what I'm kind of hearing in that is, it's almost a little bit that potentially that there's more training that's needed for folks to kind of understand the difference of, this is when I'm supposed to report something versus like, oh, this is just a family in need, and trying to connect them to different resources in the community. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, I would say so. And I think, last summer, just before this past school year started, so a little over a year ago, we did update our mandatory reporter training. And for the first time, our own training did include a prevention component to try to signal, especially to school professionals, probably our most common reporter, but also medical professionals, to try to give them some tips and ideas of when this may be more prevention matter and not so much a protective service situation.
Okay, I'm going to put a pin in that because I want you to come back and talk a little bit about the parent helpline. But while we're kind of talking about these calls that are coming in, Audrey Carmichael, I'm going to use y'all's last names just because I've got two Audreys with us today. I wanted, your past experience, you also worked at the department. I was hoping you could kind of, in speaking a little bit to what Stephen's talking about folks calling in, even in the best of circumstances, if CPS is not the right avenue, how does that impact the families that the department comes into contact with?
Let me see if I can answer that. I think, particularly if it's something that does not feel like it's abuse or neglect, calling the hotline can potentially, kick off some other things in the life of the family. And I'm saying that with Stephen right here. I don't think the department has a lot of choice. Like once something does fit the definition of abuse or neglect, I mean, there are state and federal mandates about what has to happen from that. I just think if it's one of those situations where it's not abuse or neglect, there's very limited benefit from calling the abuse neglect hotline. I think the helplines, this is my opinion, right? There's not a lot of services that you get, even if you do have an investigation opened in most instances. And I think that's kind of the promise of differential response, right? What can we do for those families who, a disposition really is not going to get you anywhere other than to confirm what you may already, know. So how do you put some concrete and other supports in place rather than focusing on, wrongdoing and culpability? So, well, there's something else I was going to say, but I think, it's really helpful that DFPS is doing the training around kind of what do you do if it's not an abuse neglect situation, and maybe some of the other options that you might have. And along those lines, I should say, I not only have like phone a friend, I have phoned multiple friends here. I'm joined by 3 of my colleagues, Chelsea Alexander, Tamika Caldwell, and Nalkaja Grace, who also have a lot of direct work with some of our family supporting activities on the provider side. So, Carrie, did I answer your question?
You did. I mean, ultimately, something that always comes to mind for me is, it's like the right avenue, right? And so I know Stephen and I've had some conversations around like, this is what statewide intake is for, right? And so, but I think all of us on this call would say, we don't want families to end up on CPS's radar if that's not the right call, right? And so I just wanted to just kind of, I feel like that was very helpful what you talked about. Just again, because we don't want to see harm to families, and this is not necessarily a dig at DFPS. It's just, again, we want families going to the right services, right? We want families getting funneled in where they can actually be helped, right? And if DFPS is not that right avenue, we want them to make sure that they are connected to services within the community. And so I do want to this kind of leads into the next part of our conversation. And Stephen, I'll have you kind of kick us off here. So we're kind of talking about right avenue, where's the right route to go. You mentioned earlier the parent helpline. So I do want to just emphasize here the difference between hotline and helpline. I think that could be helpful because I know sometimes we might use those interchangeably. So again, this first piece that we were talking about is more the hotline that we're talking about, where folks are calling to make that report of suspected abuse or neglect. A helpline is what it sounds like, right? It's where somebody can give a call and say, okay, I need help getting connected to this service. Can you talk to us, Stephen, a little bit more about the parent helpline? I know that's relatively new. As I say new, in comparison to a lot of things that are out there, but can you talk to us a little bit more about that and some of the needs you guys are seeing over there?
Yes, and it was launched a couple of years ago, kind of in conjunction when PEI launched their Get Parenting Tips website. And the way I describe both of these helplines, both the youth and the parent, it's crisis oriented. It's somebody experiencing a crisis regarding their family. They're with the youth helpline, it's mostly teens. I think with the parent helpline, sometimes it's younger kids, and it's not abuse, neglect, but it's a family that just needs some type of assistance or somebody just to talk to. The intent of the helpline is not to tell anybody what to do, or not an advice line. It's all totally confidential. It's just to hear somebody's story, what they're going through, and then offer them options. They have a pretty extensive database of resources that are, specific to the communities that they're calling from. And it's really just to give them some options. Have you thought about this? This is available in your area. Again, really not trying to advise anybody, but just throwing ideas out there, and before that call ending, having them kind of make a plan as to what they're going to do next when they hang up. I would say the common things that we see, sometimes it's substance abuse related, sometimes it's mental health related. I know, especially coming after the pandemic, we saw a significant rise in mental health concerns regarding the youth helpline calls. We still get the occasional children thinking about running away. It used to be the runaway hotline, so some of those calls still come in. And then also a lot of it is I would be honest, custody matters, especially on the parent helpline. A lot of parents are calling regarding their custodial rights, and that's a better place to address those concerns than airing it out on the abuse hotline. So we welcome those calls on the helplines as well. And so that's what they see, then that is what they try to offer.
So thank you for that. And just out of curiosity, just for our audience, the helpline, is that something they can get connected to? So let's say they call the hotline for statewide intake. are they then routed, or is it a completely different number?
Well, it's a completely different number, and also one of the advantages of the helpline is they can also be reached via text and chat, which is very convenient for a lot of the youth out there. But if you do call the abuse hotline, and our staff kind of recognize that this is something that's not abuse neglect related and is more appropriate for the helpline, once you're on that phone call with us on the abuse line, it's all one phone system, so we are able to transfer those calls over if we think the situation fits.
And do some of those calls, do y'all end up connecting them? I'm going to call it connecting to another connector. Do y'all sometimes refer out to different communities that have different connectors there?
It's typically not, I wouldn't say a warm transfer, if that's what you mean. We're not on the phone kind of passing the caller around necessarily, other than maybe the abuse line to the helpline. But if you're thinking of things like services within the phase program, yes. I mean, a lot of these referrals are going to other connector resources that are going to be local to where those families are.
Gotcha. Okay, well, thank you. Well, that kind of leads us into this, what other connectors exist? And Adriana, if you could go to the next slide for me. So we always, when we're talking about this, we always say, y'all know how we love to do things in Texas. We are very community specific. We believe communities know their communities best. And so oftentimes what you see is different communities stepping in to different folks in the community stepping in to say, okay, we see this need, we see this gap, we're trying to fill it. And so there are different connectors that exist throughout the state. You've got 211 that's statewide, but carried out by different organizations in each community. There's Help Me Grow, which for those of you who aren't familiar with that, it aims to leverage and connect families to existing resources in the community to promote child development. So it's about your younger kiddos. Then there are connectors like Find Help, family resource centers that are fantastic. Also the parent helpline that Stephen talked about. But it's very fragmented. So what you guys are seeing on your screen, like 211, the different areas represent different area information centers and what counties I was about to say AICs, but I stopped myself from doing the acronym at first. But basically, this shows what counties they cover. Then the map you see on the right is where those Help Me Grow connectors exist and the family resource centers. So you can see they're kind of concentrated in certain areas of the state. You've got some that have multiple, and you have some that don't have any, right? So you just kind of see different things happening. It's very fragmented. So I want you guys to hear from two different, again, I'm going to keep referring to them as connectors in different areas of the state to hear what that looks like in their communities. So Brandon, I'm going to start off with you. Can you tell our audience more about the contract you have with Find Help West Texas? What does that look like, and what led your organization to pursue the contract?
Sure. Thanks, Carrie. So we are in that big white area on your right map that doesn't necessarily have anything. So One Accord functions as a coordinating organization in the child welfare space between nonprofits in both the Permian Basin and the Concho Valley. We are a backbone organization for a child welfare coalition out here that spans those two areas. And what we were hearing from our stakeholder group and also our funders is that there are all these nonprofits in Midland, Odessa, all these nonprofits in San Angelo, but no clear way to actually, for a seeker to find a specific service on a specific day. There was no connector. And all of the programs that One Accord has developed have really come from our coalitions expressing need, and then us trying to figure out the best way to accomplish and solve that problem. And so we did start talking to Find Help, and I had some previous experience with Find Help back when it was Aunt Bertha as an attorney for children and parents in the child welfare system. And so was happy to see that they had grown and expanded, and we were able to essentially purchase into their database. We have a white label called Family Help West Texas. It's actually familyhelpwtx.org that just serves essentially as an on-ramp for families seeking or individuals seeking free and reduced cost services. And that allows them to put in their information, their needs, and get to a list of local organizations by zip code and some statewide that can help them address those needs. So what for us, it also provides pretty robust data on what's being sought, where it's being sought from. We have a heat map on the backside. We get frequent search terms, most commonly searched zip codes, cities, counties. So we're able to have some degree of knowledge about the needs that our community is articulating. So that's been able. So we do a couple of things for that. The easy thing is to have the website, right? That's not particularly hard. The harder thing is to get it used. It's not a valuable tool if no one uses it. And so most of our work is actually pushing out the information to CPS and FBSS caseworkers, to investigators, to schools, to other nonprofits. We attend family resource fairs, and we have some push cards that have the QR code that we hand out. We also have the information on, ice packs and Band-Aid, little Band-Aid holders. So, we're cultivating the information, talking to the nonprofits, trying to get them to claim and update their profiles on the one side, and also pushing out the information to use it on the other side.
Well, so I feel like one of the questions I was going to ask you to hone in on, I think you already kind of talked about, which is really, just this rural versus urban areas. But I am curious to know if this is something you can speak to. Y'all being able to see things on the back end, does that allow you guys to help go like, okay, well, we need these kinds of services in the community, and be able to kind of work with your community partners on how to fill that?
Sure. I mean, what comes up consistently on our side is utilities. Let me see, I was just looking at this. 28% are seeking some sort of food assistance, 31% are seeking some sort of housing assistance. And I do have more detail behind this. 13% are seeking some sort of help with goods. Others are health, transit, work. And so we are able to take this back to our coalition and saying, what are we doing to help people access housing? What are we doing to help people, make it clear to people how to access food, both in an emergency and in a go forward manner? The truth is, a lot of this is just a tool, and a lot of this requires, as people on the call understand, a great deal of assistance with the family and with the seeker. So it's not necessarily likely that they're going to get their needs met just by using this tool. So the hope is that folks at schools, that helpers who are sitting face to face with the seeker are able to use this as part of their work.
And you were talking earlier about like outreach. So to hit on that point a little bit more, it's not just pushing this information out like, hey, families, here's something that exists. It's also the providers in your community, right? Just to make sure that they know, so that they can also then extend that to folks that are seeking help, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So our use of Find Help, I will say, is like this is a super powerful tool, and it's like your brain. Like, we're using like 5% of our brain on this thing, and it could do a lot more. There's some case management features that it has. There's some closed loop referral features that it has, and the secret to accessing those additional capabilities of the tool is to talk with providers to get them to claim their profile, update their profile, use some of the referral processes that aren't just when you click to contact, here's our phone number, but when you click to contact, get a fillable form that allows for the closed loop referral system and the record keeping process on the back end to be activated.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for just talking more about what you guys are doing out there. Obviously, that is a more rural area. I want to shift a little bit here, and Audrey Roast, I'd love for you to also kind of just a little bit of a contrast to talk about obviously the San Antonio area, you know, that has a lot more, if you look at this map on your screen, a lot more colors there. But Audrey, I'd love for you to just kind of talk to our audience more about the work that you all do in the San Antonio area as it relates to like 211 and Help Me Grow. Can you share that with us?
Sure, yeah. So here in Bexar County in San Antonio, we consider ourselves very lucky to have Help Me Grow 211 and contract management of our Family Resource Center on site at United Way. When we were launching Help Me Grow, our 211 director and I really worked hand in hand to ensure that 211 best practices were integrated into Help Me Grow implementation. I will say this was partly because our 211 director had experience running a Help Me Grow in her home state of Florida. So that was invaluable knowledge for me as I had no experience in it. So when we brought on our care coordinators, they were trained in 211 operations, which gave them a really foundational knowledge about managing a resource line and navigating calls from individuals in need of support. So they are trained 211 navigators and can access the 211 database at any time when they're connecting a client to resources. And that close connection to 211, having, you know, we're downstairs, they're upstairs, really also just fosters a seamless referral process from the two programs. So if they get a call that needs to come down to Help Me Grow, it's just, you know, really easy for them to send it down. Or if we get a call that maybe, you know, doesn't fit within our eligibility requirements, we can send it over to them. It doesn't happen often, but if and when it does, we can do that. Our database uses a community-based referral platform called the Alamo Area Community Network, which United Way holds a really big stake in. It's an alliance of community-based organizations and nonprofits here in Bexar County that work together to improve the well-being of individuals and families here in San Antonio, that provides faster electronic referrals, closed-loop referrals to their partners. And when we were developing our resource database with Alamo Area Community Network, those contributing partners got together and were able to use the 211 taxonomy to make sure that our Help Me Grow database was really robust and reflected the contents of 211's database as much as possible. So that really allows our families access to a plethora of routinely updated resources across multiple sectors for to be able to address their needs.
Audrey, if you don't mind, I want to just have you pause real quick right there. So you're saying, so like y'all have, so the 211 Help Me Grow Family Resource Centers, because y'all work so closely together, that is why y'all have access to kind of the back end, that repository of resources, because it's all housed, but that's not true for everyone. So I imagine that's a challenge for areas that don't have that, right?
Correct. Yeah, and we couldn't exactly like replicate the 211 database because, you know, there's a lot of red tape there, but we were able to kind of use the general taxonomy.
Gotcha.
So we couldn't, but even without the access to the database to pull down into our, you know, Help Me Grow database that we were building with the Alamo Area Community Network, our care coordinators are still trained 211 navigators. So if ever there's an instance where they're working with a family and they come across a situation where there's not a resource they're looking for is not in the Help Me Grow database, they are able to log in as a 211 navigator and kind of find that resource in that capacity. So yes, we're very, very lucky, and we are very aware of that. But since building this amazing database, we've quickly realized that others in our community need it. And to avoid the duplication of the very intense level of work that we, put into it, we know that we will have to share it. And so one example of this is that we're currently looking at our Family Resource Center, which is another layer of support for Beaver County families in brick and mortar form, and exploring how our Family Resource Center navigators can be trained in the Help Me Grow database so that when they're doing resource navigation with their families, they have access to that as well.
So how do families, so again, you'll have like all three of these within your purview, but how do families know about them? Like, I'm assuming y'all are doing a lot of outreach with different providers. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like how folks in the community know?
Absolutely. So I like to say that last year our care coordinators were on tour across Bear County. We hit up every meeting, every event, outreach event that we could get to. But we also have several in-house initiatives and programs that we work with. So that was kind of our main focus. We have a very strong partnership with our home visiting programs, specifically like our McV program, who we partnered with last year on their CQI project focused on increasing developmental screenings. So that partnership really fostered a trusting relationship between the home visitors and the care coordinators. So now they really are kind of a feeder for us. They're often sending us referrals for their families, which often, gives them the freedom to do the work that they're meant to be doing in the home, providing those home visiting services to families rather than, putting out fires all the time. Our dual generation initiative, which is a place-based 2-generation model that answers the challenges created by poverty and increases family self-sufficiency by providing education and workforce training to the caregivers and childcare for the children. We partnered with their partner childcare centers to meet annual developmental screening requirements. And we'll do that again this year. We work with our partner childcare centers. We work with all of our in-house initiatives. And then we had a huge launch event last year where we kind of introduced Help Me Grow to the community. We have a physician champion out at one of our university health centers. So we've worked really closely with her to kind of get the word out in that capacity as well. You're muted.
I am muted. Oh, goodness. So, I've always heard wonderful things about Bear County and how innovative you guys are with all kinds of things, especially in, the prevention and strengthening family space. But can you talk a little bit about the challenges? Like what are you guys seeing there that, if tweaked, could maybe be better?
Yeah. So, we have seen a lot of challenge, specifically in connecting families to autism services, specifically therapy, family support, case management. We're getting these screens and that's great. We're picking up the number of screenings that we're doing, but just being able to get these families to the services they need. There's not enough developmental and behavioral pediatricians here. Families are having to wait up to a year to receive those services. Mental health services, both for families and for children. Rental assistance. I know that's a problem in rural areas. It's a problem here in our urban areas also. Both limited resources offering assistance and limited funding. A lot of places that were previously offering assistance were using COVID era funding that is no longer available. And so everybody's just out of funding, and the places that used to offer it aren't offering it anymore. And that's mostly rental, but we have had a few mortgage assistance. So we have a lot of families that are ALICE families, asset asset limited, income constrained, employed. And so we do know that that's a really big problem because a lot of those families do have mortgages and they don't, aren't renting, and there's not a lot of mortgage assistance. Childcare, both finding childcare centers and childcare assistance. This is huge here in Bexar County. And then just overall knowledge of resources. Lots of families that are struggling and they're unaware of what they're eligible for, and they just don't know how to apply for services and how to access them. A lot of the work that we do with our physicians isn't even so much getting families connected to ECI or referrals. It's just that they want us to kind of help walk the family through application processes or making sure that they know that they can apply or that they're aware, because they just get so lost in the steps, in the confusion of it.
And I saw Brandon shaking his head quite a lot in agreement. So it sounds like, that's some issues that we're seeing across the board. Brandon, you came unmuted. Did you want to share something else?
No, I mean, we don't have some of the resources that were just described, but we definitely, eligibility, getting access to Medicaid, people coming off of Medicaid, needing to get back on Medicaid and SNAP and benefits. And, I've not yet found a resource here that consistently can help with that. I was working with a young mother, pregnant mother with 2 toddlers, and several of us nonprofits were kind of serving her, and that was a big issue. And unfortunately, one of the volunteers, back to kind of some of what Stephen talked about, one of the volunteers in that group with a couple of churches trying to help made a CPS report thinking that they were being helpful, when we were doing what we could. It was not awesome. Certainly I think risk was definitely controlled just based on how many people were texting her all the time. And we would literally show up at a moment's notice for anything with her. But because there was some, inability to get on Medicaid, and so some issues accessing various, things, healthcare for the children, it did prompt a report. And so there's a cascading effect whenever those resources can't get accessed, together with a lack of understanding about what abuse and neglect is and what happens once a call is.
Yeah. So first of all, I just have to say this out loud. Just hearing Brandon and Audrey speak about just the different things you guys are doing. I'm so thankful that you guys are doing what you're doing in your communities, because I know that the families are benefiting from that, and just y'all are going above and beyond. And I just wanted to say thank you for that, because it's huge and it's just really coming through in the things you guys are sharing. Audrey, I wanted to ask you, I know we've talked about this a little bit before. So the 211 side of thing, can you talk about maybe even some of the challenges that y'all experience with 211?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So I know that across the state, not all 211 sites are staffed 24/7. Most are staffed 8 to 5. I think 2 or 3 maybe are 24/7. And again, we are very lucky that our 211 center is staffed 24/7. But that has a lot to do with United Way's investment in 211, because as most of you know, up until last year, state funding for 211 had remained flat. We still have a long way to go with that. But I think that oftentimes, there's a thought that callers across the state get frustrated because they're routed to other areas across the state when that 8 to 5 window is expired. But what we do know, and what I had a discussion with our 211 director here, and she let me know that callers are routed based on speaking their zip code into a prompt, and 90% of our calls here are from local callers. If a caller is waiting longer than 60 seconds, they will be routed to another 211 across, somewhere else in the state. And so because of that, we try our best to staff our 211 call center really, really heavily during the daytime to avoid them, kind of being rerouted. So, but that takes money, right? That takes funds, that takes constant staffing. And there is, a high turnover rate there because the hours can be a little tricky. So our 211 director told me, the frustration isn't necessarily a lack of access or knowledge of resources on the navigator's parts. They can very easily give resources that exist in another area of the state. It's more that they don't qualify for the resources like rental or utility assistance, or there's not enough of those resources out there, not because they can't provide the information. And a lot of frustration occurs when callers can't reach the HHSC benefits line, or they connect to 211 instead of the benefits line, either because they're trying to get around the automated system, they want to cut the wait time, or they're just confused because it's a very long automated system. And it's really important to differentiate 211 HHSC benefits, which is option 2, and 211 information and referral line, which is option 1. Option 2 is a lot to listen to, and if someone's having a difficult time, they may not want to wait and listen to all those options, and they will choose to connect to 211 instead, and they may think they're talking to the benefits line when in fact they're talking to a 211 navigator who has no knowledge of that benefits line information. And so that's a lot of time where frustration kicks in. And unfortunately, that might damage a caller's relationship with 211 and influence whether or not they call 211 for resources at a later time. And so that's, really unfortunate. And I know that's something that we are working on, maybe in this next legislative session. So, 211 always needs more specialists to field calls, especially during peak times. I think they would love to be able to spend more time with each caller and do more advocacy and support by phone and connect them directly to the service they need by transferring them to another live person and not another call queue. But unfortunately, they're just limited in their time and what they can do.
That's very interesting. So I hear, nothing's ever really simple, right? But it sounds like there's a lot of different things that kind of need to be invested in order to make sure that everything is working correctly. And again, like you said, because ultimately what we're all here talking about is making sure that families get connected to what they are asking for, what they need to be able to keep them together. So I appreciate that. So I'd like to kind of shift our conversation here to one that's obviously we're talking about the things that are happening here in Texas, but there seems to be a mentality shift happening around better supporting families, kind of in a national sense. And so I'm going to have Carol, if you could come unmuted, would love for you to just talk to our audience more about what you're seeing nationally. And so you guys remember Carol is with KC Family Programs. They have a very good pulse on what's going on in different states. And I just, wonder if there's some things that Texas could, maybe follow in the footsteps of. But yeah, if you could just kind of set the stage for us, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, thanks. And thanks for having me. Yeah, the things that y'all are touching on that Texas is dealing with is the exact same thing that there's several states nationally that are working on. There are, I think early on in this conversation, it's a two-prong approach. One, you have to make sure that you have services that are available in the communities where people live. And then the second piece is, then how do you make sure that families know how to access those services? Nationally, I think really what the conversation has been around and what you've seen the shift in is that it's the analogy or it's like receiving services through helplines whether that be warm lines or support lines, whatever your community has, but it's akin to going to an urgent care center instead of to the emergency room. The hotline should be seen, the child abuse and neglect hotline should really be seen as the emergency room. That's where you go when there is a life-threatening situation that needs to be addressed. The other things, you have a cold, you have sniffles, you have I won't say that. But anyway, but you have smaller, less urgent needs, you can go to your local community, urgent care clinic that isn't the emergency room, because you don't want to utilize the resources of the emergency room with those less serious injuries and or less serious conditions. Along with that is then changing the culture around, and what a lot of the different states are doing is changing around the culture of seeking assistance. So even in the communities where they've done a really nice job of building some infrastructure, and I think that Audrey and Brandon can both kind of speak to this, it's normalizing asking for help. It's normalizing and reducing the stigma of asking for help, and especially being able to ask for help without fear of repercussions. So often what you hear from the folks with lived experience and the families that have utilized these services is that there's a real fear in, if I go and I admit that I need help with a certain need, that then is going to precipitate unwarranted intrusion into my family and or is going to expose me to CPS. So what you see in so some things that folks have done is really like investing in marketing campaigns. Louisiana has done a really nice job. They have the Kid Line, and they also have My Community Cares, and they've really done a lot of work around doing kind of that marketing piece and really trying to normalize that everybody experience issues. Everybody, it's okay for asking for help, and keeping it very separate from any kind of association with child protection. Child protection is very different than child well-being, and trying to utilize where those services come from. And in Louisiana, through the My Community Cares model, what they've been able to do is be able to offer follow-up. I mean, when they give a referral, obviously with the family permission, they're able to they have folks that actually reach back out. So it's a little bit more of a warm line, because you have some folks that can reach back out, make sure that they were able to get their needs met, provide emotional support, things like that. Florida has been doing a lot of work in this area as well. Tampa's 211 line, I think, probably is fairly similar to what Audrey, y'all have been doing in Bexar County, where they've tied things to their 211 line to try to provide some navigation and services to their families. More recently, Virginia has really been doing some work around trying to they've utilized Casey has what the community opportunity map, and what we're able to do is we're able to bring in census data for folks to be able to look down to even the zip code of like, what is the education, the education rate for that community, what is the economic rate for that community, what does housing look like in that, down to that zip code and or county. What is that zip code's accessibility to food, housing, internet, transportation, so that you can take a more targeted approach to where you want to invest in your services. And so Virginia is kind of taking that approach. The one thing I say more than anything, whenever I talk about kind of the national landscape, no one area has mastered it. If there was the silver bullet that we could just go in and say, okay, they've gotten it right and we're going to model it after that, then I think everybody would be thrilled. The ongoing struggles around rural versus urban and just the access to resources is just ongoing. We're doing some work right now with West Virginia that's really kind of more focused on access to resources that are really around the substance abuse stuff. And how do you provide resources to family and or referrals to families, still trying to maintain, because if you have a family or a parent that is seeking assistance, you still don't necessarily, it still doesn't equate unless there's a safety issue. It still doesn't mean that there should be a call to the hotline. So can that be served in the community with substance use services at the rural level, so that folks who want to get help will reach out and get the help and be able to do it without some kind of government action and or state action involved in it. So, but yeah, so it's, there's a lot of, everybody wants to do it. How to fund it, how to correlate, coalesce services around it, how to bring the nonprofits in. A real promising thing that nationally folks are using is just the access to, utilizing the faith-based resources that are available. What we know is churches are oftentimes the center of a community. The families that need services and or the families, they either are attending the church or a member of congregations, or their family members are a member of a congregation. So where is it that those churches might be able to step up and provide those resources? Lastly, it's around folks have struggled, when we talk about hotlines and helplines, it's the weighing do you create a whole nother helpline then just as another? So then you have the disparity around, who do I call? Do I call 211? Do I call I don't know that anybody wants another, and each of those have their own set of issues. So are we just creating another potential line that doesn't need it? Or how can we better take the services that are already out there that folks use, which is why I think 211 is so promising, is because I think 99% of the communities have access to 211. So how can we better use 211 to be that facilitator, because our people already know, and or 311. But how best to connect, because you still have the disconnect of your professional. So if you're a teacher or if you're a medical professional or you're just someone in your community and you're like, hey, I really want this family to have access to services, it's way too hard. I think all of us on here can agree that, to pull up what you used to call the yellow pages and figure out like who do I contact? It's a lot. I mean, and even Googling it can send you down all kinds of rabbit trails with, sponsored websites versus non-sponsored websites versus, folks that say that they're free, but then they're not really free. So it's like, how do we organize that? And I think that's what the thing that a lot of states nationally are really kind of talking about and really trying to build coalitions around, trying to dig in and how do we solve that problem. It seems to be that doing smaller pilot projects helps. I think we all know that doing something statewide is never easy, nor does it always work in every community. So trying to figure out ways to do it in more pocketed areas that then you can work out the kinks and then potentially grow and expand upon tends to be a promising practice that states have been utilizing. But yeah, it's been exciting because I think that the national recognition that we want families to be able to be served in their communities, and they're better when they're supported early on before things get into a crisis, is, I don't think that there's a state out there that disagrees with that. So, and that isn't trying to make that happen for their families and their communities in their state.
Well, thank you for that information. I mean, I'm always so encouraged, when we have this conversation, because I do really see that, again, this shift from, whether we're going to be reporting to the hotline, like Stephen was talking about earlier, versus, okay, we want to make sure that families get, the services that they need. And just to be clear, we're not necessarily saying, don't report when there's something that needs to be reported, right? We're saying, like, hey, sometimes what a family needs is just, a little help to get by, so that we're not ending up in a situation where CPS actually needs to be called. And something else, Carol, you touched on, that I feel like we've had conversations about is, again, Texas is, West Texas is different than Austin, which is different than San Antonio, which is different than Dallas, which is different than El Paso, right? So, everything, here, it is important to be able to have that flexibility, but the answer is not, just this one thing, right? It's making sure that, all of those are connecting. And I think you use the word organized, which I appreciate. Just kind of using those coordinated efforts so we're not duplicating things for families and making things more confusing than necessary. So, Carol, you kind of touched on this too, and Audrey Carmichael, I'd love for you to chime in because you guys represent a lot of providers. So like if we start shifting in this direction where we, all of these connectors are working together and we're making sure that families are getting what they are getting sent to what they need, right? What is something that's really important that we consider? Like what do you have any thoughts about this as we move forward in this direction?
Yeah, definitely. And thanks for thinking of the provider perspective. I'll touch on this a little bit, but we've kind of seen flare-ups where things shift in direction, but there may not be sufficient infrastructure or resources to then support the mindset shift. So this is sort of a bit of a recap of what's already been said, but it's almost like there's kind of two components to the front end working well. Mandatory reporters not only need to know where to send people, because I think a lot of our mandatory reporters think, oh, I'm helping, or they don't know the consequences of initiating that call if they're just looking for help. So mandatory reporters need to have some understanding, but it also needs to be realistic, right? They can't go through themselves a list of like 1,700 different options. It needs to be a meaningful referral source helpline where it's not overwhelming like 211 can be for a family in crisis. I've been getting, Chelsea and Tamika and Nolkaja and I have been talking a little bit on the side because they hear from a lot of families who have experienced crisis and are showing up at FRCs or wherever, and going to 211 can be completely overwhelming for a family in crisis, as I think a lot of us know. So it needs to be a helpful system in place that the mandatory reporter can easily, distinguish between, okay, if it's this, then I call hotline, and if it's something else, and here's where I would send people. And then just some of the kind of different thoughts that I gathered or had about what it might look like for the community-based angle to be successful. Definitely anything that's universally available and with non-invasive screening and eligibility. A lot of times if people have to self-identify as having, this was touched on a little bit with it might trigger a CPS case, but it can also be very shaming. Like if you have to self-identify as a victim or a survivor or share some of that in order to access services. Truly being community-based without state significant involvement or government significant involvement. And that can be tough to do because the way that resources are structured, government becomes the default because resources aren't distributed across the communities as they could be. And a current example of that for us is we are a recipient of a state grant to help deliver community-based mental health services. However, you have to come up with a match, and you have to not duplicate state services. There are all these not necessarily barriers, but it's not always easy for smaller community-based providers to step into the space that government has occupied. So it just becomes this default. Another factor that I would say is important, and this is just Audrey, but I think there also needs to be a pretty clear division of responsibility where there is legal intervention potentially needed. One of the things that we saw when DFPS had some changes in practice around family-based safety services cases and, older youth in particular, is we had some pretty extreme cases where like a young girl who was exposed to a sexually abusive step parent showed up at a shelter. There's no legal mechanism. If DFPS isn't picking up the case, there's not a legal mechanism for that shelter to really help. We had kids show up with bruises, and so it's just important that where we draw the line, it's never going to be perfect, but that it's appropriately taking account of the fact that in some instances, legal intervention may be, or some type of intervention may be needed. And then another thing we grappled with when, removals went down and FBSS cases went down is that, you don't want to surveil families, but there's also not a great way to know if what you're doing is working at a community level. And so how do we put systems in place to make sure that the things we're doing are helpful to families, but also not surveil the families and track them across, programs. So I don't know, that was kind of a lot, but thanks to my colleagues for their thoughts. And yeah, that's it for now.
Y'all, I did it again. I started talking and I was muted. So can y'all hear me now? Are we good? Okay, sorry. No, Audrey, that was great information. Just again, because like I said, we want to make sure that we're thinking of all of these different components. Because like I said, we can talk about like kind of the ideal, right? But we've got to make sure that we're thinking of all of those little potential bumps along the road, things that we need to just account for. So I appreciate that. So we have 23 minutes left. I have not been looking at the chat to see if any questions have come in, but I do want to just kind of turn now, or if you've held on to your question, feel free to drop it in the chat. Or you know what, if you feel so brave, come unmuted and ask your question for anybody on this panel. Hopefully that didn't scare anybody to offer that up. But we just have such a wonderful panel here today, and it's such a big conversation. I want to make sure we have some space for questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm April Waters, and I'm just over here in East Texas, and I'm learning, about things through the social work program but with the 211 option, you're saying that those are trained in some way, and then you're saying that they're listening. So my question is, are your 211 the people answering that, are they trained? Like, in what way are they trained besides accessing resources and connecting people to resources? Are they trained to listen and hear beyond what's being said? Or are they offering emotional support in some way? Can you just fill me in on that?
Audrey,
Is that for me?
Audrey, that might be a good one for you.
I think that's for me.
Yeah.
So I'm going to assume that you're asking in reference for our care coordinators, our Help Me Grow care coordinators. So our care coordinators for Help Me Grow are trained during their orientation to Help Me Grow. Part of that includes orientation to 211. So they spend time in the 211 call center being oriented as they would if they were hired on as a 211 navigator. And so they receive that same level of training, and they in essence become a 211 navigator. And so they're trained to access the database, they're trained to take calls, they receive all of the same training that those navigators take, which includes handling calls with empathy and handling callers in crisis and all of that, and like navigating all of those types of situations. But then the other level of that is that they are Help Me Grow care coordinators, right? And so they specialize in dealing with families prenatal to 5 years old. And those families are calling our warm line and asking questions about how their child is developing, behaving, learning, or growing. And then also calling just to access resources in the community. And Help Me Grow is a 360 referral line. And so it's kind of like 211 on steroids, basically. And they also have the ability to do developmental screenings for those families. So they're providing those resources and then calling back a couple of weeks later and saying, were you able to access those resources? If not, why not? Can I help you, kind of break down those barriers to access? And then we're always looking at data and the data that we get back and taking that back to our Early Childhood Coalition to see what strategies can we identify and develop to kind of reduce barriers to those gaps in services that we're seeing in the community.
But April, to answer your question, Audrey did a fantastic job of talking about San Antonio, but San Antonio is really unique. They, as she mentioned earlier, right, like their United Way puts in a significant amount of resources over and above what the state gives to them so that they can do this in a fully robust way. When you look at the map of Family Resource Centers and Help Me Grow sites, there are quite a few Help Me Grow yellow dots, but each of those handles their front centralized access point differently. In San Antonio, their centralized access point is 211, and those are staff that are trained in both navigation systems. And so there is a really unique opportunity to make sure that it is not a 211 only trained person that is held to a level of outcomes and accountability that is only 211 focused around connecting to community resources, right? So the 211 area information centers that you see across the state, there are only a few of those that are Help Me Grow sites as well. I believe Wichita Falls, Corpus Christi, San Antonio, Austin, those may be, and Houston, I believe, those may be the only 211 area information centers that are also Help Me Grow sites.
Yeah. And I will say again, I was very lucky to be able to work with a 211 director that had knowledge of Help Me Grow implementation. And so she was, when I brought the opportunity to her, she was completely on board in partnering and kind of, grading implementation together. Because otherwise, I don't know that it would have worked and it would have happened.
I'd like to add something to this, April. Something I was kind of hearing in your question too was just this kind of like from the empathy kind of standpoint of like just the understanding and maybe almost like, I was starting to kind of think like a trauma-informed kind of approach. Something I know we didn't talk about this today, but we had a previous webinar on kinship and kinship navigators, for instance. Those folks have a very unique understanding of the needs of like families and friends of the family, and whenever they step in and care for a kiddo. And I know something that they prioritize with their navigators is that it's folks with lived experience. So they, there's that empathy in the sense that, hey, I've been where you are, I've had to try to navigate this and those kinds of things. I'm curious if Brandon or Audrey or anyone could speak to, whether it's 211 Help Me Grow. Is that a priority to try to hire folks with that lived experience? Is that something that y'all can speak to?
Frankly, Carrie, that's a luxury for us out here. And, there's a reason why there's a big blank space in the middle. And that's that we don't really think about the distinction between urban and rural services in Texas. I-35 is populated with family resource centers and Help Me Grow because those grants and contracts make sense for those communities. In our community, we don't necessarily have the organizational infrastructure for some of those grants. They don't make a lot of sense for our community. So, a grant that had a lived experience requirement, for example, would be super hard for us because we struggle with staffing any program. Part of that's the oil industry, super low unemployment here. So, I mean, the things that come out of Austin out here that were really envisioned along I-35 largely don't make sense for us. So yes, we would love to have lived experience, super important. But at the same time, like we're down at like the elementary or kindergarten stage, and that seems like at least like a junior high concern.
Thanks, Brandon. Carrie, we do have two questions. I think the first one goes to Amanda Finney. Amanda, can you come off mute and maybe articulate your question? Amanda's with the King Foundation.
Hi, I apologize. I can't be on video and I have very spotty internet, so I hope you can hear me. I am with King Foundation, but also on the steering committee of the Texas Child Welfare Funders, and I put that link in the chat. I wanted to just speak up in representation of the steering committee. We have been publicly quiet, but are very soon making some announcements about the strategic planning we've been doing this summer, which essentially is giving us some direction, because trying to go from just a North Texas group to statewide is, as Carol Self recognized, a kind of impossible. So we recognize the need to work regionally and are looking for funder champions in each region. And we have contacts in many regions, but not all. And April Waters, you said you were from East Texas. I think I'd like to talk to you after this call. And so we are just looking for more funder contacts in each region. And there are some that I can talk to specifically. Region 4 is one where we have very little representation, if any. And so we'd like representation in each region so that we can have funder gatherings that are regional and can talk about regionally what are the most important and, low-hanging fruit, and then the more complicated systemic things that we can be helping to pull levers for, because we recognize we have some position of responsibility as well as privilege, as well as ability, and we want to deploy all of those as best we can. But it is often challenging for us to know the best ways to do that. And we also are managing our own little complicated ecosystems of boards and various opinions and things like that that go into the decision making in our offices. So the people on the steering committee are very passionate about this, and anything you think you might want us to know, we probably want to know. So please let me know if there's anything that you all have, especially right now where we haven't really formed it and deployed it yet, but we are looking for regional champions of funders who can kind of help gather their peers to start talking about these things more regionally with the service providers there in the region and just figure things out. And we really want those to be very regionally led, and then they can report to us as a steering committee so that we can then see if there's cross-regional collaboration or coordination that can help to share the good ideas and things that are working and not working, just to better, be effective across the state.
Thanks. I just wanted to share, Amanda, if you want to put your email in the chat, that way people know how to connect with you.
Sure.
But I also wanted to suggest that two thoughts on that is, in some of these communities, the funding that comes from PEI, now FSS, has created an opportunity to fund a local collaborative. And so the state itself, PEI / FSS, has been the largest funder of preventative and support programs like the ones that we're talking about. And if you talk to folks like Sarah Abrahams at, again, PEI, now FSS, she really views their work as something that they see themselves as a funder, but in partnership with community. So I think she would be a really good champion to talk to, and I'm happy to connect you with her. But then I would also encourage you to look at some of the local United Ways, who in some communities are the largest funder of this kind of work. And so we can certainly help connect you, or United Ways of Texas. I'm taking off it's hard for me to take off that hat, even though I left 2 years ago, but it is, the network of United Ways are definitely a good resource for you to connect to. And if you need help with that, I can definitely help as well. But please reach out to Amanda. She put her information in the chat. But we had another question from Let me scroll back up. Andrew Novak, which legislative initiative do you think will be the most actionable this upcoming session? And are there any Texas House or Senate members that have been particularly good allies in this question? Thank you. I believe we had at least 4 legislative offices present today. So thank you to everybody that is here. Maybe Carrie, do you want to respond on, are there any legislative initiatives that we're looking to be actionable this session that build on some of today's conversations, and maybe others can follow Carrie with that?
So I'll mention a few things. One, you heard us talk a little bit whenever we were talking with Stephen Black earlier, about just the importance of professionals knowing what exists in their communities. And whenever they are seeing a circumstance where a family is needing help or a family has reached out, that they know where they can connect them to, and not put the onus on them to know every single provider in their community and whether or not there's wait lists and things like that. So, one of the things that we have talked about is trying to implement some training to make sure that professionals know. And again, that would be community specific. We're not, we understand the nuance in each community. They need to be able to do that how they see fit. And so that's one thing that we've talked about. Another, we know that last session there was a bill to basically be able to leverage 211 better, and just kind of provide a little bit more infrastructure there. And again, kind of the idea behind it was to remove some of the duplication of efforts for them to be able to share that repository of resources, since that is something the state already invests in. And so, that's something that we're working with United Ways of Texas on. And I know you were asking for some specific legislators. Representative Busey led that effort last session. Several people signed on to that bill and co-authored and authored the bill. It was Representative Capriglione, Rose, Lujan, several others, though. There does seem to be some momentum, at least in the House, with that bill. And so that's one other thing I would say. I would say also just generally funding. We want to see more funding for Help Me Grow sites. We want to see more funding for family resource centers. They're all doing such amazing work connecting families to resources. We want to make sure that more of those exist. So I would say that those are kind of the 3 things that I know Tex4Tex wants to put our weight behind and try to get done this next session. Does anybody else want to chime in? I don't know, Audrey, if you have some, or either Audrey or Brandon, do y'all have some thoughts?
I will say one of the things I meant to mention earlier is that our members, our SSCs, the SSCCs that are providing services through the Texas Family First pilots have experienced success with the delivery of those services. And one of the things that we heard when we brought people together, including families who had participated, was their experience of feeling like they were being helped versus someone showing up to their door to interrogate and intrude. And so I don't know that there's a specific vehicle, but I will say, continuation, looking at those services is definitely something that is on our priority and just sort of on our priority list. Sorry, that was not a complete sense. I'm trying to talk fast because I know we're all close to out of time, so that's
Thank you, Audrey.
Yeah.
I'll go to add on to what you just said and to circle back to what Carrie said on the first point about training. And this tags into what Carol said as well. Some of the other states that have really done an interesting job in the mindset shift, it really has been because they've done these awareness campaigns, and training is perhaps the wrong word, more facilitation, more mindset and awareness change, so that folks are understanding how better to connect families to resources, as opposed to the reporting when it's not necessary. And so it's really important that that training aspect, if that's something that we pursue, that it not be coming from the state necessarily, so that folks are not worried about that aspect of it. So Audrey, I think that'd be something to talk about later if you're interested. What we've seen Casey family initially funded in Arizona and has been implemented in several other states, this approach called Lean on Me. So we're interested to see about what that could look like in Texas.
Another thing I want to just add real quick, and it's something that Carol mentioned earlier. You know, as we talk about different things that, you know, legislative action on connecting families to resources, it must be paired with the fact that we need a full continuum of preventative services funding those as well. So again, just, we don't want to have those conversations separately. They need to happen together. Just want to iterate that.
Carrie, can I make a rule pitch for a minute?
Yes, please, Brandon.
So some of these off-the-shelf programs, like Adriana just mentioned, that, you know, have these names and are parachuted in from other states, they just don't really work out here. We're not ready to take those things on in the same way. We have had really good experience with a regional collaborative grant that we have through the Alliance, where we serve as the regional coordinator for that grant. And we have deliverables, but our work is done through developing, you know, providers to do the actual work and following up and focusing on outcomes. And so there's just we welcome rural pilots, I would say, out here. I'd say that big white space is there for a reason. And just growing things that already exist that aren't in that big white circle doesn't necessarily help us very much.
And I love that, Brandon. And I'll say that maybe we're just not articulating it correctly at this point, but what they've done successfully in other states is create a framework that allows it to be created from the community to look like what the community needs, right? So how do we support families in Odessa is going to be different from how do we support families in San Antonio, right? And so that's why I say it's not necessarily a training, it's more of a facilitation to help with the mindset shift, so that the person that you talked about from the church that called CPS perhaps knew better not to do that, right? Because they've been part of that community facilitated work. And that's the Lean on Me structure. So it's not necessarily an in the box, in the shelf thing. Every state has been doing it differently based on what the communities need. So just to clarify that. So I hope that makes sense. Lastly, I wanted to share a question from Andrea Sparks. Is there a need to help grow the Help Me Grow helpline to include families with older children? Anybody want to take that?
I was just actually typing a response.
Okay.
Yeah, we definitely see the need for that. Help Me Grow North Texas has actually adopted the model and the framework to serve 8 to 17-year-olds and calls it Help Me Thrive. And we'd love to do something similar eventually here in Bexar County. You know, the model framework works, so why not expand eligibility, right?
Awesome. Well, we are up at 12:30. Thank you. Thank you to our speakers today, our panelists, and thank you to our series sponsor, Casey Family Programs. Thank you, Carol, for being here today and for the support. Thank you to Brandon, Audrey, and Stephen, and everybody who was here. Thank you so much. And please reach out to Carrie if you have any additional questions, and we'll be following up with the slides. Thank you again. Bye, everybody.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.